From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. Today's topic is Latinidad in film. And my guest today is Carlos Aguilar. He is a freelance film critic based in Los Angeles. He's been writing about film for over 10 years. In 2014, he was awarded the Roger Ebert Fellowship, and he writes film reviews and conducts interviews with directors and actors. And you can find his work in the LA Times, New York Times. He has a recent article in Variety reviewing the Mexican entry to Best International Film. It's called We Shall Not Be Moved, or No Nos Moverán. And you can follow him on Instagram at Carlos Film. So welcome to the show, Carlos.
Thank you for having me.
So to become a film critic, it means you love film, right? So how did you develop that love of film?
Yeah, I think, I grew up in Mexico City, uh, in a very sort of like humble family. And so we didn't have video games or we couldn't afford to take vacations. So I think my mom, the sort of the thing that we would do for fun when we could was going to the movies. And so that became sort of like the thing that I would ask her for birthdays, for when I would, get good grades, like sort of any type of celebration or reward. I would always ask to go to the movies. And so, watching a lot of animation and kids' children at first. And then when I was around maybe 11, I want to say, or 12, there was a film critic on Mexican TV who recommended this French film, Amelie. And, that was sort of like, I convinced my mom to like trek across the city because, like in LA and other major cities, like a lot of the international or art house films are usually played in the more affluent areas. And so that movie wasn't playing near us, but we crossed the city to go see it. And that was like a big revelation for me to see movies, from another country. And Amelie is such a unique sort of film in terms of, the form and the way that the filmmaker tells the story. And so it was a really like a big thing for me, kind of showed me film beyond watching, the more commercial animated films and children's stuff that I was watching. And then maybe like a year after that, there was a contest. One of the Mexican movie theater chains, Cinépolis, they had a contest that if you guess the winners for that year's Oscars, you will get a card that would allow you to go to the movies for free for a whole year. And so my mom entered the contest because I was too young, but I told her like the answers based on like me reading or watching things about the Oscars. And so we won this card, and for the next year, we could go to the movies for free, in many, many theaters across Mexico City. And so I would literally go to the movies like every day for that year, like every time after school, like I would just go by myself to the movies and watch everything. I was sneaking to movies that I was probably too young to be watching. And so I feel like that, that combination of sort of discovering international film and having the opportunity to watch so many films in bulk, that really sort of like solidified my interest in film. I mean, originally I wanted to be a filmmaker, which is kind of like a cliche when people that write about films. But my circumstances when I came to the US, as an undocumented person, kind of prevented me from pursuing filmmaking as a career. And so I found a way to, kind of like serendipitously, I wasn't planning on becoming a film critic because it's also like a thing that, you really, when you come from perhaps, an immigrant or Latino background, it's kind of like not a thing that you could really aspire to. Like, you don't really, set out to be like, I'm going to be a film critic. So it just kind of happened out of my desire to be involved with film and writing for myself, and eventually sort of like finding places that would let me write about movies. And like you mentioned, the Roger Ebert Fellowship was like a big deal for me to sort of like take this more seriously as a career path. But yeah, it's been definitely a lifelong obsession with movies.
So you watch all kinds of films, films from all around the world. Uh, so, but what about Latin American films? In looking at Latin American films compared to films from other parts of the world, is there something distinctive about Latin American films? I mean, Latin America is made up of many different countries, right? But there is some shared historical experience. And by Latin America, I'm including Brazil, a Portuguese-speaking country, but mostly they're Spanish-speaking countries with, of course, indigenous populations. So yes, do you think there is something that unifies Latin American films, something distinctive that separates it from American films or European films?
I mean, for one, films from Latin America, because of the amount of resources that it takes to make a film, this sort of the barrier of entry, they tend to be speaking in very generally, sort of very political. There's a tradition of political cinema in Latin America, which I think stems from the fact that a lot of filmmakers might think that when you're going to invest those resources and sort of like you have to make something that means something in a sense. There's of course in every country there's very commercial film, but I think the films from Latin America that transcend, its borders and travel tend to be sort of the more challenging political, films, which can be a double-edged sword. I feel like at some point in the last few decades there's also been, conversations about whether, exporting all of these films that deal with the misery and tragedy and kind of hardship of Latin America is also sort of catering to a European, perspective that those are the kind of stories that they want to see from Latin America or that they expect from Latin America. So I feel like some filmmakers have tried to sort of like, you know, deviate from that expectation of having films from Latin America always be about the hardship. But I do think that there is an inherent desire in a lot of Latin American filmmakers to address the injustices, the difficulties that, unfortunately are basically a shared thing across, the developing world, not only Latin America, but, Africa or countries in Asia. And so, yeah, and speaking specifically more about Mexico, which is, where I'm from, where I'm more familiar with, there wasn't really an industry for a few decades between, let's say, like the 70s and the 2000s. Those 30 years, there were, a lot of like kind of like lowbrow B movies that were being made. It wasn't until the early 2000s with, you know, Iñárritu en Amores Perros, Cuarón and Y Tu Mamá También, and sort of like that batch of filmmakers that started sort of creating the new Mexican cinema. And that also has to do with, the financial support that the government provides for filmmaking. It has kind of like ebbed and flowed depending on who's in power. But that's a key difference, I think, when it comes to also Latin American cinema, that most governments, even if it's, not sufficient, most governments in Latin America have certain funds that filmmakers can access to make films. And that's such a huge difference in comparison to the American system, because when a filmmaker is able to get funds for their film and the return of investment, meaning that the box office is not so important, that means that they can make whatever they want. They can really take risks. They can really make films that are challenging and that are not concerned with making money. And, there's again, pros and cons against that because it's an industry and, people, you want to kind of make a living out of it. But I do think that that's the key difference, that because they're able to get some money from the government, that provides a certain freedom and independence from the desires of the industry. And so I feel like they're able to often make more challenging films because they're not beholden to the box office.
Right. Uh, And the development of streaming has impacted American films significantly. What type of films are being made and budgets uh, and streaming is available across Latin America. So have you seen streaming impact Latin American filmmaking in any significant way in the last several years?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like streaming has, impacted filmmaking all over the world. I will say that, another thing that's very much persistent in Latin America when it comes to the film industry is that uh, local productions, like films made in those countries, have a very difficult time getting an audience because audiences in Latin America are accustomed to watching American movies. And so a lot of the movie theaters in Latin America, or specifically Mexico, they play, the American blockbusters, and there's very few spaces for Mexican films or homegrown, for local filmmakers. And that's a pattern that repeats across Latin America and many other countries. And so I think that's a challenge that's been sort of like there for a very long time, that, the government has tried to, at least in Mexico, to sort of like help by, demanding that some cinemas, play a certain amount of like Mexican films, or, that they support, local filmmakers or Mexican filmmakers. And so that's kind of like already a built-in challenge, to get an audience from Latin America to want to watch a movie made in their own country. It's a challenge. And so I think streaming, has, provided perhaps another avenue for maybe people to discover certain films that they might not see in the theater, which, one wishes that people would want to see these movies in theaters, but at least some of them are being discovered in streaming platforms. And, a company like Netflix has really sort of like made a big push in Mexico and Latin America. I think kind of like a big moment was when they financed Alfonso Cuarón Roma, and, gave it like a huge awards campaign. And, Alfonso Cuarón managed to kind of to not force, but like convince Netflix to let him have a theatrical window, at least to show the movie in theaters, at least in like independent theaters. And so I think that since then, Netflix and other streamers have really been invested in creating, developing work in Mexico. And so a lot of Mexico's and Latin America's most important filmmakers have worked with the streamers, making films or making, TV shows for the streaming platforms. And so I think that they've really become a strong force in Latin America. There's the positive and the negative, like with everything, but yeah, there's definitely a big presence of the streamers.
Right. And so Latin American film has received international awards. This past spring, the winner for Best International Film was the Brazilian film I'm Still Here. And so in the past year, what are some Latin American films that have stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a strong year. Definitely, the Brazilian film that's, representing Brazil at the Oscars this year, The Secret Agent, by director Clever Mendoza Filho, who has been a presence at festivals for the past decade with movies like Aquarius and Bacurau. He's a very, fascinating filmmaker. So I think that one's really strong. It's a movie also set in the 1970s, also dealing with the, dictatorship in Brazil, but from a different angle. It's sort of like a crime thriller with like genre elements, with Wagner Moura, the actor that people might recognize from Narcos Mexico. He played Pablo Escobar in Narcos. He's a very well-known Brazilian actor. So that one I think is sort of like the standout for me. But there's, as you mentioned, the Mexican film that's representing Mexico at the Oscars, No Nos Moverán, We Shall Not Be Moved, which it's opening in a few theaters in the US, and then it'll be on streaming at some point early next year. And it's a movie about the 1968 student massacre in Tlatelolco in Mexico City, but seen from the point of view of the present. And so it's a woman, an elderly lawyer whose brother was murdered, was one of the students murdered during this massacre. And for the last 50 years, he's been trying to get justice. And so it's a character story about this woman. That the filmmaker uses this character to sort of observe and analyze this unhealed wound in Mexico's past, that they the government and hasn't fully addressed. The perpetrators haven't been, kind of brought to justice. And, every October 2nd, which is when it happened, there's still protests in Mexico. So yeah, that's another one. Again, even with this couple of films, you can see that a lot of these films tackled, the difficult past and present of Latin America. So those two are definitely great. And then there's a Colombian movie that's Colombia's Oscar film called A Poet, Un Poeta, and it's kind of like an uncomfortable comedy about a failed poet who, in order to sort of like kind of boost his career, he discovers a young poet from an underprivileged background and tries to sort of mentor her into becoming a poet. And it's a film that's interesting not only because it's a comedy and an uncomfortable comedy, but also because it talks about the expectations that the art world or any kind of institution for art has of people from underprivileged backgrounds. They want you to write about trauma, they want you to write about the misery you've experienced. And so, what does that say about the art world when the expectation is that they want you to sort of like mine your trauma for spectacle? And so, yeah, so I think that it's a really strong year from Latin American cinema with these new voices making interesting work.
Is there a Latin American film that you feel really hasn't gotten much international attention, but that you watched that, impressed you? Uh, or something
Mm.
like, I know you like animated films. Is something you like to focus on? Is there something from Latin America in recent years that has stood out that maybe deserves more attention?
Yeah, I mean it's not particularly new. It's maybe from like 2, 3 years ago. But there's a Chilean movie called The Wolf House, La Casa Lobo, which is a very peculiar stop motion animated film by this Chilean duo of filmmakers, which is about, based on a true story about a German Nazi colony in Chile. And so it's sort of like a horror film done in stop motion. It's very unsettling, but I think it's really fantastic. I mean, animation is, still kind of in not its infancy in Latin America, but it's not a medium that's still it's a medium that's still developing in the region. There's another movie that I don't think is released in the US yet. It's a Mexican film called Frankelda. I am Frankelda, Yo soy Frankelda, which is Mexico's first stop motion animated feature. It's very much in the vein of the work of Guillermo del Toro, who is actually being kind of a mentor to those two filmmakers. It's a movie set in like the 19th century about a young woman who wants to be a writer, and then sort of like her fantastical world mixes with her reality. It's really impressive. And stop motion, for people that don't know, is literally like figurines and physical sets that are photographed one photo at a time to create the illusion of motion. And so it's very painstaking and very labor intensive kind of way of making animation. And so it's very expensive too, because all the sets, all the costumes, all the figures have to be physically built. These are puppets that they built. And so I am Frankelda. I played at a festival here in LA called Animation is Film. It's a all animation festival that happened in October. So hopefully it gets other screenings or ends up on a streaming platform. But yeah, that's definitely an impressive one and Mexico's first stop motion feature film.
Right. So you mentioned Guillermo del Toro. He just came out with Frankenstein on Netflix, and he's one of the so-called Three Amigos. These Mexican directors, Cuarón, Iñárritu, del Toro, they've won Best Director Oscars. They've made the majority of their films are in English, right? And there are a number of Latin American filmmakers who have made English language films who go back and forth. Uh, but those three are probably the most prominent. And do you think they carry their Mexicanness, their Mexican identity experience in those language films, like say even Frankenstein or other films that they've made? Uh, or have they become really more international filmmakers? How do you see them?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balancing act, right? Like, I mean, I could say, and I've heard people comment about sort of Frankenstein having this very Latin American melodrama to it and sort of the emotions of it. But still, it's a movie in English set, in Europe. And what is that, how does one find the sort of Mexican identity of Guillermo in it? And I think yeah, it's an interesting question, because these filmmakers because they have been so successful in Hollywood, they have to not cater, but their movies have to appeal to, a wide audience. And it's only when they sort of go back to Mexico and make a movie in Spanish that perhaps is a different sensibility. I'm thinking about Iñárritu's most recent film, Bardo, which, was his first film in Mexico in Spanish in like 2 decades or 15 years at least. And so that movie was sort of like received mixed reviews in the US, and in Mexico I think was a little better received perhaps. I think he won some awards there. But it is interesting, to see how they're perceived now that they've lived, away from Mexico for so long, or like when Alfonso Cuarón went back to make Roma, after living abroad for so long. The balancing act is it's interesting, and how much of their identity can they really put when they're making a movie, with Kate Blanchett or with, Bradley Cooper or with these actors, one could say that just by the fact that they're the ones making it, that's, it stems from a Mexican consciousness because they're the ones making it. In Frankenstein, he does cast Oscar Isaac, who's I think he was born in Guatemala. And he's a Latino actor based in the US. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I feel like when it comes to the three of them, it's always kind of challenging to discuss because it's like they've become so successful. They came from Mexico. They sort of like honed their craft in Mexico, and then they came to the US to work in the studio system after having already sort of built a career there, which is a very different experience than a US born Latino, whose identity is sort of like more American, but has still, roots in in Mexico or in Latin America. The opportunities are different. There's usually a class divide, like the children of immigrants here. So yeah, it's an interesting question when you think about the difference between Latin American filmmakers and US Latino filmmakers here. There's definitely a very different experience when it comes to accessing resources and making work.
Yeah, and so what did you think about Frankenstein overall? Do you think
Oh,
this remake was a success?
yeah, I'm a big fan of it. Yeah, I really loved it. I thought it was really great. I mean, to me, it just feels kind of like a companion piece almost to Pinocchio, his animated stop motion animated film from a couple years back. This sort of father-son relationship and the notion of life and death and reality and the monster and the humor. I think the human, sorry, Monster and Human. I think Del Toro really likes to work with these sort of dualities of, life and death, monster human, father son, good and evil and whatnot. And I think I think Frankenstein really is sort of the pinnacle of the films that he's been making for so long, and it's the movie that he's been wanting to make for, his whole life. And yeah, it's a lavish period piece. It's a movie that was possible because of the streaming, era. Netflix is the one that sort of like footed the bill for, I think it's like $150 million movie, which is such an immense amount of money because, the costumes and the sets are physical sets and, the makeup and the special effects and whatnot. And so, I think it's really, all three of them actually, Iñárritu, Cuarón and Del Toro have now made movies with Netflix. This sort of like their big epic movies. Bardo was a very expensive, Netflix produced film. Roma was a Netflix film, and so I think it's interesting that what you lose is that you don't get the big theatrical release that you will get with a traditional studio. But at least these filmmakers are getting to make these passion projects in in substantial ways, with the right amount of resources. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Frankenstein for sure.
Right, and so you have these Mexican-born directors getting these big budgets for these films. Uh, but what about, Latinos in the US trying to make films about the Latino experience? That seems to have been a struggle. Uh, looking back at A film that was successful is an animated film. Like Coco was a film, right, about the Mexican experience, made in English. So talking about English language films, though of course it was translated to many languages. That was a success. Encanto was another animated film that did relatively well during COVID. But other films, most it seems, it's a challenge to make English language films that focus on Latinos. So, what do you think are the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think the big challenge is the access to resources, right? A lot of Latin American filmmakers, it's still a challenge in Latin America to sort of like apply for the funds that the government, has allocated for film, but they exist, right? There is sort of like a window, a possibility that if you're a filmmaker from Latin America or, specifically, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, which are countries that have Brazil that have these funds that you can apply, and if your idea is great and or if you whatever is the reason why they select your idea, you will get some money, then you will get to make it. But when you are, a US Latino or, US born Latino filmmaker, you don't have access to those funds because that doesn't exist in the US. There's no public funding for film. It's an industry here, and so all of it has to come from, private money. And so that's, one of the key things that makes a difference, that in the development of a national cinema in Latin America is that the government invests. And so you as Latinos have to sort of like fight, not fight, but like sort of like, try to get resources and compete with all of the other filmmakers, established or not in the US. And so there is definitely a lack of stories about Latinos in the US. There have been some through the years, but they're very sort of like few and far between. There's filmmakers like Alex Rivera with Sleep Dealer, or Aurora Guerrero with Mosquita y Mari, which is a film, set in Huntington Park, in Southeast LA, about two young girls in high school. They're Mexican American, so the movie's like mostly in English, but when they speak to their parents, they speak in Spanish, and so it feels very authentic to like a US Latino experience. But there's very few of those, and then when you do get some, um, oftentimes they tend to be sort of like very broad, or like stereotypical. You have, gangsters, or you have, and not that you could not make an interesting story based on those things, but I do feel like those are the type of films that we get to see when we do see Latino stories in English, about Latinos in the US. And so I think it's an industry that doesn't appreciate those stories enough, that doesn't provide the resources for filmmakers to make those movies about the Latino experience in the US. And because they don't have access to public funding like the Latin American counterparts, it's sort of like a bigger uphill battle. I mean, I think over the last decade, there's been a lot of like organizations in the US that have, incubators or fellowships and things to develop, stories about Latinos in the US, like NALIP, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers. They have fellowships. Netflix, I think, started one with LALIF, the Los Angeles International Latino Film Festival, where they fund like short films by emerging Latino filmmakers. So there are certain opportunities, particularly when it comes to shorts. But for, a US Latino filmmaker to make a feature about that experience is definitely, a really a tough challenge, a tough, an uphill battle, because, the industry doesn't want to give the money, and there's no public funding, and so how do you manage to make a film? Lastly, I also wanted to mention that there's a class component, right? Like in Latin America, a lot of the people that get to make films, they come from, perhaps not, the wealthiest families, but definitely for a middle, upper class families, because even to study filmmaking, is expensive endeavor, and so even in Latin America, the people that get to make movies come from a higher social class. And Latinos in the US who are children of immigrants who are, maybe first generation, they tend to come from more working class backgrounds. And so when you come from those backgrounds, aspiring to a film career, going to a USC or UCLA at Chapman, that, the tuitions are so incredibly expensive. There's also a class sort of barrier of entry, for Latinos in the US. And so I think the collection of all these things is what makes it so difficult for those movies to get to the screen.
Yeah. Have you seen something in the past year, a Latino independent film or short film that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, there's a movie called Pony Boy that it's by a Salvadoran American filmmaker, which is I think they're intersex, and they go by they them. And it's sort of like a semi-autobiographical, fictionalized story about their experience being, intersex and being, first generation Latina. So that one premiered at Sundance in 2024, but it only made it to theaters in 2025. And so that one's really good. And then there's one called Serious People that just opened in theaters a couple weeks ago, and that's by a duo. There's these two Mexican American filmmakers, uh, Pascual and RJ Sanchez. Pascual Gutierrez and RJ Sanchez. They have this collective called Clica. They're from South LA, Mexican American guys who kind of cut their teeth making music videos. So they made music videos for Bad Bunny, for The Weeknd, and now they made a feature film that's sort of like meta, kind of like blurring the lines between reality and fiction, and it's called Serious People. And that one premiered at Sundance this year, and it finally opened in theaters a couple weeks ago. And so those are kind of like the main examples of like independent, U.S. Latino stories that have actually succeeded at making it to the screen and playing at major festivals.
Yeah. Well, a big film that uh, in part covered the Latino experience wasn't by a Latino filmmaker. It's one battle after another. Uh, it opens with this revolutionary organization liberating immigrants, migrants trapped in a detention center. Benicio del Toro plays a major role as someone protecting immigrant communities. The film was made before the election of Donald Trump, but speaks to our times. And from what I'm hearing, it's considered a front runner for the Oscars. So, but things can change in the next coming months. So, how did you see the film and the way, in particular, Latinos were depicted in the film?
Yeah, I found it very kind of impressive in that sense. I think that even beyond Benicio del Toro, there are other, supporting parts. I wrote a piece about a group of skaters who are all Mexican American who have, a few scenes in the film, as kind of these heroic skater, Mexican American skaters who help, Benicio del Toro's character and Leonardo DiCaprio's character, who are, local El Paso, Chicano Mexican American guys who were skaters who were cast, from the community in El Paso, and so who now, have this kind of a big moment being part of this, this major film. There are scenes in the film that are, only in Spanish that don't have subtitles, where, Benicio del Toro talks to, the immigrants that they're sort of like keeping in a safe house. And I feel like those scenes when you see Benicio del Toro with like the immigrants that they're keeping in this safe house, um, to me they feel kind of like very sympathetic, and rather than this being sort of like ruthless smugglers, they're portrayed as like they're kind of concerned about these people. And you can make a case for like, is that a fiction? Are the smugglers ever that nice? But it does feel like there was a sort of care and concern for those characters rather than sort of like making them, faceless or whatnot. And then throughout the film, you see kind of like Leonardo DiCaprio, he runs into, a Latino vendor in a corner and like, asks for his directions or asks for help. And like, I feel like there was, at least it seems, that Paul Thomas Anderson um, put in the effort to sort of like fold in the Latino community rather than sort of like just may put it in the background. Of course, Benicio del Toro's character is sort of like the flashiest sort of like Latino representation in the film. But there's even references to the Mexican Revolution and certain things. There's like, near the end, there's like a Spanish language Mexican song. And so I do feel like there was an effort, to sort of like fold in and in kind of include uh, the Latino community when you're making a movie about this revolutionary group that's trying to, liberate immigrants. So I feel like, yeah, I was kind of impressed by, there's certain details or lines of dialogue, things like that feel so very specific that I think come from including people from the community, like the skaters, who some of the Spanish phrases they came up with, or they sort of like they inserted them into the story. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that for such a big production and that's making waves in awards and in the film world, I'm glad that there was interest and care in including Latino characters more than in a lot of Hollywood films that deal with immigration or with these issues.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation on film, and hopefully there'll be more Latino films coming in the near future. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.